Hey everybody, it is Brandon Washington again for The Drive. It is Tuesday. It is the 2nd of April, the day after April Fool's Day. This is not a joke, I am coming to you live. So I am going to be waiting to see if anybody jumps in. I just saw Mr. Smith jump on. Mr. Smith, always a wonderful person. Good to see ya. Jason Smith. I had a huge crush on his sister growing up. Dated his sister for a little while. He's a great young man. He's an old man now, just like me, and an all-around wonderful person. Jason, do you have anything you want to talk about today? I got a few requests after the last show to talk a little bit about the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that's going to be one of the topics for today. But of course, I want to remind everybody that I'm trying to do an open show where we can talk about anything on this drive home, especially business, especially social work, anything related to employment discrimination. But again, I will remind everybody, and I'll take this off right now, anything that I express during these conversations are my opinion and my opinion alone. I am not representing the government on this call. If you have personal questions about a situation that has happened to you that relates to employment discrimination, we can talk about that in general. We can talk about discrimination in general as well, not related to employment discrimination. Any of those things that fall under that term, we can talk about. Now, I know that there was a lot of talk over the weekend about Nipsey Hussle. Of course, influential rapper out here in California, but much more than that. Of course, this gentleman was a avid supporter of his community. He was a small businessman. He did a lot of really great things for the community. So, hearing the news about him, the first response, of course, was not too surprised, only because of some of the circles that he had said to have been running it. But that kind of gave me a little bit of pause because, the first reaction that I had was, hey, rapper, that's the life he chose. But then when you sit back and you think about it for a little bit and you take it from a little bit of a more nuanced perspective, you hear of a person that was a rapper and put forward all the usual things that are put forward in rap, and then that changed and became a person who saw that rap was a positive thing sometimes and a negative thing other times, and decided that he was also going to become a influential member of his community. And he did that by opening some businesses, giving people some jobs, giving back every chance that he could. And I think that gave him a different perspective. And when hearing about the news about him, I shouldn't have that same perspective that a lot of people have, where we just assume that if your profession is a rapper, that you must not be doing anything good for society. But in the same token, and in the same vein, and in the same light, there is the question of personal responsibility. And I think that when we start talking about personal responsibility, and especially when we're talking about gun control and violence and community violence, and specifically black on black violence or ethnic and minority violence, or even larger majority violence, the defining factor in all these things is the violence. You can say it's about guns. We could take away the guns and it would be about knives. We could take away the knives and it would be about fists. So I think that the defining factor that we all have to realize is that no matter what it is that we're talking about here, we are talking about a little bit of something that's missing. And I would say that that's something that's usually missing is compassion. We've talked a lot about different ideas that people have to regulate guns. There are a lot of people who are out there who talk also about lots of programs that may be able to help victims of gun violence. But a lot of the things that are being put forward and a lot of the things that have already been proposed in the past are reactionary items. They are things that can possibly help after that violence is gone. So I think it begs the question of the larger conversation. And that larger conversation is, again, and I hate to say it, about personal responsibility. Now, most of the time when you hear somebody start to talk about personal responsibility, usually it's just, hey, your group did this, your group is bad for doing this, you need to take responsibility. But I think it's a little bit of a bigger issue than something that we can just point to one group or say that this one group needs to fix that, or even a few groups need to try to fix this one problem. It is a problem that we all need to fix. And as much as we want to fall back into our tribes and fall back on those things that keep us comfortable and safe from reality and addressing the issues that we may have with ourselves, and then the issues that we may have in our community, and then the greater issues of what is happening with the nation in general and in large. So some people have proposed that there is a good way to fix the violence issue, and that would be to turn more towards nationalism. And folks, while you're here, I always want to remind you, if you know anybody else who wants to jump in and talk about this, go tell them to jump on, or tell them to watch this afterwards, or discuss it, make some comments, and tell me something that we could talk about a little bit more on the next go-round. But like I was saying, it begs that greater conversation about what we could do all together. And of course, with the rise of populism, with our current Commander-in-Chief, Donald Trump, that populism has brought back up the notion of nationalism. Now, for those of you watching that aren't quite aware of what nationalism is, you can just think of nationalism as, if you take something as simple as ethnic pride, and you say, this is a perfect example, African Americans, black pride, where you love your ethnicity and your culture and you want to tell people about it. Think of nationalism in the same way, but instead of it being for your own ethnicity or your culture, it's specifically for this nation. Now, being a military guy and being a person that has spent quite a while in the military, obviously I've got a pretty strong draw towards patriotism and things that relate to this great nation. And that is one of those things that's usually a good draw for people for nationalism, and that's the military services. But one of these solutions that's being put forward is a new call to nationalism, and for people to be a bit more involved in setting a specific standard of what it means to be an American. And again, it goes back to that conversation about personal responsibility. So we can kind of look at this in two different lights. If we're going to say that we have these violent issues that are happening here, and at first we wanted to say that these things were based on just ethnicity, and now it seems to be shifting from ethnicity to class, and then of course sometimes it shifts from class to mental health. So it's always all encompassing in the few different manners and fashions. But as we move away from those individual things that we can blame violence or the prevalence of violence on, again, it moves back over from that individual realm that we can point to individual groups and goes back to that greater question of what we are all doing for as a greater good to address the issue. So unfortunately, that always lands back on personal responsibility. Now, what is personal responsibility? Does that mean that I am in charge of everyone in my community that happens to look like me? If you asked me that question 4 years ago, I'd say, no, of course not. We're all individuals, and that's one of those things about America, rugged individualism. But I think that this call for more nationalism is making us kind of ask that question of, do we believe that there is a specific definition of what an American is? And if there is a specific definition of what an American is, there obviously has to be some guidelines and some items that have to be met to meet that criteria of being a good American. So that, of course, begs that question of what is the criteria? How would we set a criteria? And if we did set a criteria, could that criteria help us to be less violent? So, of course, there's an argument to be made here for nationalism. There's an argument to be made that if we could take everyone's focus off of individual issues that are happening to themselves and to their respective group, and place the onus more so on an idea of what an American is, and then allow people to try to meet that standard of what an American is, it kind of moves everything out of the range of race, and then it moves everything out of the range of a tribe, and then it moves everything out of the range of class-based items, because you can be rich and love your country and love all the things about it, and you can be poor and love your country and all the things about it. Now, we get into a bit of the weird stymied waters whenever we get to the point where we start saying that a certain racial category makes you American, or a background, only military members, only police officers. It has to be something that is calling all people together, and if it was to work, it would have to be all-inclusive to anyone who joins this great nation too, which then opens that larger debate about immigration. So if we can't end violence through regulations, meaning background checks and making it super, super hard to own a weapon, do you think that a call to nationalism, and then within that nationalism, you define a characteristic that calls for non-violence against other Americans? Do you think that something like that, some kind of call to action and a set of national standards of what an American is, would give enough of the people who are seeking attention something that they could glom onto? Would it be enough to give people who need a sense of pride or belonging something else to glom onto too? Would that also allow these folks and those rules that we put in place to dictate our behavior a bit better? And it would also seems like it could be something that could set the tone, could stop some of that violence, that could reduce some of those things simply by making sure that there's a set of standards that we can all get onto and that we can all agree upon and then hold each other accountable to. And that, of course, goes to that question of personal responsibility. So that's that first topic of discussion. I know that was a little bit long-winded and all the way around to bring up the point of nationalism, but I do think it is something that we should explore, especially with the rise of populism and the rise of nationalism to go along with that populism. Okay, new topic and new subject. Of course, I'm driving home, and I want to make sure that I break up all of this long-winded talking with something fun, so I think we will have a very quick dance break. Let's see if there's some music. Okay, that was enough of the dance break. We'll try to make it a little bit longer next time, and you guys are always welcome to suggest a dance. So, of course, the next topic that we have is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a very, very, very powerful legislation that can deliver quite a few benefits to those of us who have a disability. Now, I guess I can start by talking a little bit about some of the things. I will pause for a second and tell you the reason I bring this up is a good friend of mine was on the last live announcement that we were doing, or live meeting that we were having here, and he was asking about a serious disability that may prevent him from employment. And so I wanted to just, again, discuss the ADA just a little bit so you get a better understanding of what some of those things that can be provided via the ADA and some of the things that may be a little more difficult to receive, especially when we're talking about employment. Now, the Americans with Disabilities Act, when we're talking about enforcement of either reasonable accommodations because you have a disability or a record of a disability, there's two things that we're looking for. First, either an active and exhibiting disability, and that could be prong number one, or it could be number two. It could be one of these items that is a record of a disability that you have had in the past. Now, if somebody denies you your request for a reasonable accommodation or tries to use your past medical history against you, you may have been discriminated against. Now, of course, everybody's situation is different, and everything that we go through, especially your disability and how your disability affects you, might affect the outcome of a reasonable accommodation investigation, or it may be something that may play a factor into an investigation of discrimination that has been launched because somebody is using that record of your disability. But first and foremost, let's talk about what constitutes a disability. Now, obviously, folks, you can get hurt all over the place. If you get hurt at work, most of the time we're talking about workers' compensation. Workers' compensation and reasonable accommodations and discrimination based on the record of a disability are all totally different things. If we're talking about workers' compensation, we're really having a conversation about liability. We're talking about an employer that has had an employee get hurt on their premises and site, and possibly they may be liable for taking care of the well-being of that employee until that employee is back to their previous condition. Now, when we're talking about a reasonable accommodation, it's usually someone who already has a disability, currently exhibiting disability, or a record of a disability, and then that disability's effects have now manifested in the workplace. So, of course, a reasonable accommodation request is a request to change some aspect of work to allow you to be able to continue lower extremities, and you find out that it's starting to flare up. You could then go to your supervisors and say, oh, we lost our connection there, folks, but Facebook has told me that we are back and we are up and running. So before we lost connection, I was telling you that if you believe you have a disability, and that disability is one of those things that is currently manifesting, you have that ability to go to, and again, this is general information, you have the ability to go to that employer and state something to them. And you can state, I would like a reasonable accommodation. It could be as simple as that. There's no magic words. There's no specific script that has to be said. There's no particular things that specifically have to be said at that moment. Now, they may go back to you and they may say that they would like you to provide some information from your doctors. And that's perfectly well within their rights. Because it's a process that is, what you're doing is, of course, you are presenting that disability to the employer. The employer is then going to jump into something called an interactive process meeting. Now, of course, prior to jumping into that interactive process meeting, they may ask you to go and see your doctor to get both a diagnosis and a prognosis. Now, of course, that diagnosis is going to talk a bit about whatever that disability is that you believe you have, and then that doctor may give some suggestions on how to make sure that that disability's symptoms are mitigated in the workplace. So the first thing, diagnosis, and then prognosis. That prognosis is going to give some mitigating things that could help to stop the exhibiting factors of that disability in the workplace. So your doctor is generally going to put some items onto a list. Those items that he's going to put on that list are generally going to say, hey, this person is restricted from this, or this person is restricted from that. This person can't lift this person can't bend this. Just some general suggestions that your doctor has made specifically about what has happened to you, and how those items that you may be asking for in the workplace could allow you to continue to do those essential functions of your job. Because remember, folks, the key question and the key factor in this is that whatever it is you're asking for will allow you to continue to do those essential functions, because at its most basic form, work is for work. Okay? So, now that we've talked a little bit about what an accommodation request is and the interactive process meeting, let's talk a little bit about a current exhibiting disability or a record of a disability. So let's say that you got disabled when you were in high school and you broke a leg, let's say. Now, obviously, a broken leg could be a temporary disability while that leg is broken. Once that leg is healed, it may not be considered a disability anymore. Now, let's say that broken leg turns into a considerable limp or something other than that has some other associated items that go along with it. Now that item that was a temporary disability is a permanent disability. That would fall under prong number 1, and that could be a currently and actively exhibiting disability. Now, let's say that disability that turned into that ailment that turned into a disability is now in remission and you don't even notice it anymore. That could be a record of a disability. Now, how do both of these two different things factor into the modern workplace? Well, if that disability starts to flare back up, or if that disability is actively exhibiting, prong 1 or prong number 2, of course, like I just mentioned, you can go to your employer and ask for some change in the workplace to allow you to do those essential functions of your job. Now, of course, this, at that moment where you disclose your disability, this, in a lot of the instances that I've seen and a lot of the things that are out on the internet and a lot of employment law that's out there, they will tell you that sometimes that disclosure in that request is the most detrimental period for somebody who has a disability, because of course you're letting this employer know that you have a disability, and you're letting him know that disability affects you and your work in that workplace. And literally, when you are making a reasonable accommodation request, you are literally saying to the employer, I cannot perform the essential functions of my job without this accommodation, because you are making an accommodation request. You're stating that your disability is affecting you to the effect that it is affecting the major activities that you have, your major life activity, and affecting the way that you conduct your work. So, be very careful when you make a reasonable accommodation request, because that reasonable accommodation request could make a whole other set of problems that you did not know that you were going to be facing. For example, let's say that you are disclosing a disability, but at some point, while disclosing that disability, the employer places you out on a medical leave. Is anyone have that situation happen to them that's out there? I'm sure there's someone who has asked for a reasonable accommodation and then have been placed on a medical leave. You might be on a medical leave as we are speaking right now. Sometimes employers have the ability to, if they can't find that reasonable accommodation, or that is while they are looking for that reasonable accommodation to suit whatever your doctor has suggested and that you have suggested, they may place you on that medical leave. And commonly, I see a lot of people who come in because they are placed on one of those leaves, and they're a little bit scared about what can happen next. Now, there's a common misnomer that while you are on medical leave, you cannot be terminated from employment. Well, folks, I will say in a lot of cases that is not true. Of course, it depends on what place you are in, and it depends on what kind of leave you are out on. Some of those leave periods, we consider those leaves, especially if it was FMLA leave, that is a protected form of leave and provides you with a lot of different protections that can help you while you're out there trying to convalesce and get or figure out what accommodation will meet your needs. And leave can be an accommodation. But in a lot of cases, there are folks that go out on these medical leaves and they don't find an accommodation that will fit. The respondent can find an accommodation that will fit. And now that person has already told the organization that they can no longer do the essential functions of their job, and thus have given the employer the opportunity to terminate. It's a tough situation that you can be in disclosing your disability, so it's always one of those difficult questions to ask of course, I need a reasonable accommodation to do my job, but is this disclosure going to put my job in jeopardy? Well, folks, I will tell you that there is an answer, and the answer is if you believe you need a reasonable accommodation, you should ask for it. Now, it depends on when you should ask that, and we could, if you have specific questions, we can talk a little bit about that offline. But more to come on reasonable accommodations, more to come on how to ask for a reasonable accommodation, and of course more to come on community violence or any of those other items there. Now, another topic that I wanted to bring up, because I had a good friend tell me that one of the topics that they wanted to talk about was SBA loans. And more specifically, when we're talking about SBA loans, what are some of the SBA loan items that are good for veterans? We have a lot of people who are interested in starting a small business, and those people who are interested in starting that small business are usually looking for a little bit of funding on how you can do that. So I had somebody who had reached out to me last week who wanted to talk a little bit more about SBA loans, and I figured now is a good time to jump back in. Oh, Manny Acosta is telling me that the broadcast was interrupted. I wasn't even aware. I was droning on like I usually do, because this is what I do. I just start talking and talking and talking and talking and talking and talking again. So if any of you missed that, the last portion, we were talking about reasonable accommodations. We were talking a little bit before that about community violence and nationalism. In particular, when we were talking about nationalism, I'm hoping that some of my fellow military folks that are out there can talk a little bit about the positive items that go along with nationalism and some of the negative items that could go along with nationalism. Also, if you have a suggestion on a topic about gun violence or how we can reduce gun violence or violence in general, please put your suggestion down in the box so we can talk about it the next time. But I did want to bring up those SBA loan portions. Now, if you are unfamiliar with an SBA loan, that of course stands for the Small Business Administration. And SBA loans are pretty amazing because if you have a business that is already up and running, at least 2 years. If you have a business that's up and running and you have ideas of expanding that business or making that business bigger, an SBA loan can be really, 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 really amazing for you, because especially if you're a military veteran, because there are very low funding fees for the SBA loan, and if you fit their very strong criteria, they can be funded very, very, very quickly. If you happen to be a service-disabled veteran like myself and many others that are out there, you can get a Patriot Express SBA loan with a 0% funding fee, which is an amazing thing to think about. Now, most people will say, what's the difference between an SBA loan and regular loans I can go and get from my bank? Well, there's a few key differences between those SBA loans and the regular loan that you get from your bank. But the most important item that banks love, and the reason why they love giving out SBA loans, is because it is backed by the Small Business Administration. So that means instead of being in a regular situation where that bank is making the loan just to you and looking at some of those collateral items or whatever you're putting up, this organization is not just looking at you. When you have an SBA loan, they are looking at the SBA first, because they know that they're going to get a guarantee that if you default on that loan, the SBA is of course going to pay them first. So if you're thinking of a mortgage and you have 2 different creditors, maybe one of them's in the first lien position and the second creditor's in the second lien position, just think of you getting a loan with the SBA as with any bank that offers SBA loans, as the SBA is in that first lien position, and of course you are in that second. So no matter what, that bank is going to get their money. So they are pretty happy to provide SBA loans in those situations, because not only are they guaranteed that if you don't pay, the SBA is going to pay, they have you to fall back on after it. So that's 2 people in that line of progression to get their payment. And so it makes, if the qualification standards, of course, very tough, but if you fall into those qualification standards, you can be approved for an SBA loan, and SBA loans go a very, 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 very long way. So let's say that you are not a organization that's been in business for those 2 years prior, and you're interested in an SBA loan too. Well, there are some really good programs that go in line with the SBA, and I would encourage you to take a look at it for organizations that are smaller, for people who are startups and don't have much experience there. The SBA has some great programs on there that can help you build your business plan. They have a pretty good website to help you do the financials for that business plan, and they have a program called the 8A program, which is a very amazing program that pits bigger businesses with smaller businesses to try to give you kind of a sibling parent relationship, or a supervisor subordinate type relationship, so that you get the skills of a larger organization, but the opportunity to compete and be recognized as a smaller business, not one of those larger businesses, and have those items have basically some non-compete other than you competing with other people who are in that 8A program. Of course, you should consult the SBA to find out more information about that, but it is a valuable resource. Valuable resource. And of course, next week we will talk a little bit more about SBA loans as well. Each day that I come to you, I'm for at least for this first week to 2 weeks, I'm gonna just be throwing out topics and talking about them for a very short period of time, just so we can get a few things that are out there and spark some conversation, and to think of some things that we will be talking about in the next talks that we're going to be having. One of the other topics that was suggested last week is for all of those military veterans that are out there and military family members who have veterans who have not looked into applying for veterans benefits. I spent a good amount of time doing some volunteer work with the local Veterans Administration Vet Center over here, offering a little bit of employment counseling to those folks, a little bit of cognitive behavioral therapy, problem-solving therapy. And so those items are things that I'd love to discuss with you. If you haven't already sought counseling, if you haven't already done an e-benefits package to apply for veterans benefits, veteran disability benefits, or veteran education benefits, I'd love to talk to you guys a little bit more about some of the perks about applying, some of those pitfalls, and some of the things that can make you a bit more successful whenever you are putting in an application through e-benefits, or if you're going to a veteran service organization to put in an application. There's a lot of different things that you can do, especially if you are a veteran. You can put that package together yourself, and when I say e-benefits, what I'm talking about is the system that's put in place for veterans to receive veterans benefits based on a disability. We can also, I'm also talking about VA benefits that are based on education, and there's also vocational rehabilitation. I participated in our vocational rehabilitation program, and I keep on losing signal here, folks. So I went through the e-benefits process myself. I worked with a veteran service organization afterwards when I was working on my particular disability rating. And since I had that opportunity to go through that myself and to help some other veterans go through by putting together their packages, I'd love to talk to you guys a little bit more about it. E-benefits, a wonderful online system that will allow you to put almost every part of your benefits package together right there online. Of course, you're going to have to provide those supporting documents and, of course, information. But it's always a great opportunity to make sure that if you were hurt or disabled during service, that the government can be accountable for that item that happened to you, and that you get the benefit. Oh, and we're back. So, like I was just saying, hey Dan, how are you? Good to see you, man. If you haven't put a veterans package in, you want a little bit more information, the next podcast or live stream that we're doing, we'll talk more about those veterans benefits. That's e-benefits, so if you have questions about e-benefits, get those questions, put them in the box below. If you have questions about vocational rehabilitation, our vocational rehabilitation program through the VA is amazing if you get into it. There's some really great benefits for education, there's some really great benefits for job placement, and there's some really good opportunities to have the vocational rehabilitation program place you into a federal job. Okay, so there's some really good benefits. If you have some questions about vocational rehabilitation, please let me know. Oh, Dan, I see you. Look, Dan, if you want, hit me up offline. I'll tell you some tips to help. All right, and that goes for any of my veterans who are out there who are recently separating. If they need some, you want to talk a little bit about that transition. You want to talk a little bit about some of the really great offerings that are out there that will help you in that transition. Like a website from, I'm not sure if you're in the Army, if you're in the Navy, or if you're in the Air Force, it doesn't matter. There's a website called Cool, for example, that offers some credentialing opportunities to military members who have recently separated. Those small things, those little bitty tools can be really instrumental to making your transition from the military world to the civilian world successful. Now, most of us, we know that we're getting out of the military, and that's the only real thing that we're thinking about. You're thinking about all those wonderful, great times you're going to have, all those beers, and all that grass that's greener on the other side. But that usually stops us from making good, comprehensive plans on what we're going to do. And even if you have made some good plans, sometimes, the best laid plans always fall through. So that can happen. If some of those plans have fell through, and you want to talk a little bit more about how vocational rehabilitation can help you, how the education that's attached to vocational rehabilitation can help you, how the job placement that is attached to vocational rehabilitation can help you. All of those things are within reason for us to have a talk about. All right. Now, there's also some items that we can discuss about. Again, those e-benefits package. So I will encourage you to go ahead and put those questions in the bottom of the discussion. And next week when we jump on, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, guys, I want to remind you that this first week is just going to be a little bit short. I'm not going to stay on these topics for too long, not too much of a deep dive, until we've figured out a few things that we really want to talk about. All right? So, guys, I want to make this fun for you. I want to make this fun for me. And, of course, I'm just going to keep talking anyway. So I'm hoping that you will tell some other people to tune in. If you don't tell them to tune in, I hope you will share the video with them. And hopefully, after about a week to 2 weeks to a month, we will have this down to a well-oiled process and a well-oiled machine. And we will be cranking out answers and having a good old conversation about the things that are important to you, your family, and your life. Folks, it has been fun. I appreciate you riding with me on the drive. I'm going to jump right back in here tomorrow. We'll try to be a little more focused. But again, I want you guys to think about those big questions that we were talking about today. Gun violence. If you're in the military, we were also talking about the benefits that you may be eligible as a military member, especially as a disabled military member, and transitioning. And of course, we talked very briefly about SBA loans. If you want some more information, or if that's actually a topic that you want to discuss on a deep dive, let me know. And of course, I want some suggestions on the dance break, of what dances can be done during that dance break. If you have any other suggestions, please let me know. Let's talk a little bit more, and let's make this a real conversation. I appreciate you guys tuning in. Thank you much, and have a wonderful night.